Don't look at him directly. Ever. Mrs. Alvarez said it the way you'd warn someone about a live wire, her hand gripping my wrist a little too hard as we stood in the marble hallway of the Kang estate. My first day. I hadn't even set down my bag yet. Who? I asked, though something in her face already told me I didn't want the answer. Mr. Kang. She lowered her voice like the walls themselves might report back to him. He notices things. Everything. Just do your work, keep your eyes down, and you'll be fine. I nodded, even though nothing about that felt fine. I'd taken this job because I needed it, badly. 3 months behind on rent, a mother in Ohio who called every Sunday asking if I was eating enough, and a bank account that made me flinch every time I checked it. A housekeeping position in a private residence in the hills above the city, cash under the table, more money in a week than I'd made in a month waiting tables. I didn't ask too many questions about who the Kang family was. I'd heard whispers. Shipping companies, real estate. A name people said carefully in restaurants, like it might overhear them. I told myself it didn't matter. I would clean. I would leave. I would not be seen. The house itself felt less like a home, and more like something built to withstand a siege. High walls, cameras angled into every corner, men in dark suits who didn't introduce themselves and didn't need to. I kept my head down exactly like I was told, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies down a corridor so long it seemed to fold back on itself. It was the 3rd day when I first saw him. I was polishing the banister of the grand staircase, sleeves pushed up, humming something under my breath to keep myself from thinking too hard about how tired I was, when I felt it. That prickling awareness you get when someone is watching you and hasn't announced themselves. I turned. He was standing at the top of the stairs. Minho Kang didn't look like what I expected. I'd built some image in my head from movies, an older man, cold-eyed, cigar smoke and gold rings. Instead, he looked barely older than me, dressed in a black suit with no tie, the collar of his white shirt open just enough to show ink creeping up from his chest to his throat, dark and intricate, disappearing beneath the fabric like a secret his skin was keeping. His hair was damp, like he'd just come from somewhere he didn't want to talk about. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, the way you'd look at something unexpected in a room you thought you knew completely. I dropped my eyes immediately, heart slamming against my ribs. Sorry, sir. I'll be finished here in a moment. Silence. I could feel him still there, still looking. Then, finally, footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, moving past me down the stairs. As he passed, close enough that I caught the faint scent of cedar and something sharper underneath it, he said only 2 words. Keep going. That was all. No anger, no warning. Just those 2 words, low and even. And then he was gone, swallowed by the house. I stood there gripping the polishing cloth so tightly my knuckles ached, trying to understand why my hands were shaking. For the next week, I told myself it had been nothing. A boss noticing an employee, the way any employer might. But I started to notice things too. Small things I couldn't explain away. The chores that once seemed randomly assigned started clustering around wherever I happened to be. If I was dusting the east wing, an errand would call me toward the study, where I'd catch him at his desk, papers spread in front of him, men in suits standing at careful distances like they were afraid to breathe too loud near him. He never looked up when I entered, but I always felt it. The moment his attention shifted, however briefly, toward the doorway. One afternoon, I was gathering laundry from the guest wing when I heard raised voices from downstairs. Not shouting exactly. Minho didn't shout, I was learning that much. But something colder. A man's voice, pleading, breaking on certain words. I froze at the top of the stairs, laundry basket forgotten against my hip. Never meant to take from the family, Mr. Kang. I swear on my life. You swore that already. Minho's voice was quiet. That was the worst part. It never rose. And yet, I didn't hear what happened after that. Mrs. Alvarez appeared at my elbow like she'd materialized from the wallpaper and steered me firmly toward the kitchen. "You don't need to hear that," she said. "You don't need to see that. You understand?" I understood, or I thought I did. But that night, lying in the small staff room I'd been given at the back of the property, I couldn't stop replaying the sound of his voice. Not the threat in it, the control. Like he'd already decided the outcome before the man finished pleading, and everything after was just formality. I should have been afraid of him. I told myself I was. The incident that changed things happened on a Tuesday, 10 days into the job. I was carrying a tray of tea up to the study. Mrs. Alvarez was out sick, and I'd been pulled from my usual rounds, when one of the men in suits stepped directly into my path at the top of the stairs. He wasn't one I recognized. Broader than the others, a scar cutting through one eyebrow, and something in the way he looked at me made my stomach drop before he even spoke. "You're new," he said, stepping closer than he needed to. "The maid." "I have a delivery from Mr. Kang," I said, trying to angle around him. He didn't move. "He likes his coffee delivered personally, huh?" His mouth curved in a way that made my skin crawl. "Lucky guy." "Excuse me." I tried again to step past. His hand caught my wrist, not hard, but enough that the tray rattled, tea sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Relax. I'm just talking to you." "Let go." "Or what?" "Or he lets go of you in pieces." The voice came from behind me, and I felt every drop of blood in my body go still. Minho was standing in the doorway of the study, and I had never seen a person's expression change so fast as the man's did when he registered who had spoken. His hand released my wrist like it had caught fire. "Boss, I know what you were doing." Minho's voice hadn't risen at all, but the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Get out of my house." "Boss, please, I didn't mean..." "You have 30 seconds to be off this property." He didn't look at the man again. His eyes were on me. On my wrist, specifically, where red marks were already blooming against my skin. Something moved behind his expression, something controlled and violent all at once, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," I said, though my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. He stepped closer, and up close, I could see the tension coiled through his shoulders, the way his jaw worked like he was holding something back by force of will alone. He didn't touch me. He just looked. First at my wrist, then at my face, like he was cataloging every piece of what had almost happened. "You'll bring the tea to my study every day," he said finally. "Personally. No one else." It wasn't a question. I understood somehow that it never would be. "Yes, sir." He held my gaze a moment longer than necessary, and in that moment I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before, that whatever this house was, whatever he was, I had already become something to him that I couldn't quite name. Something worth protecting. Something he intended to keep close. After that day, everything shifted, though nothing was ever said aloud. The man with the scar never came back. I never learned his name, and I never asked what "off the property" had truly meant for him. Some part of me, the part that still wanted to believe I worked in an ordinary house for an ordinary family, refused to consider it too closely. But another part of me, a part growing louder every day, understood exactly what kind of family I had walked into. I brought the tea to his study every afternoon at 4, exactly as instructed. The first few days, I set the tray down, murmured a quiet "sir," and left as quickly as my feet would carry me. He never stopped me. He barely looked up from whatever documents covered his desk, columns of numbers, shipping manifests, names I didn't recognize and didn't want to. But by the end of the first week, something began to change. "You always come at 4 exactly," he said one afternoon, not looking up. "Never 4:01. I froze halfway through pouring. "Is that a problem, sir?" "No." A pause, then, quieter, almost to himself. "I've started listening for the clock." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, finishing the tea and setting it beside his hand with careful precision. When I turned to leave, his voice stopped me at the door. "Hannah." It was the first time he'd used my name. I hadn't even known he knew it. "Yes?" "Sit for a moment." It wasn't a request I could refuse. Not really. Though something in his tone made it feel less like an order and more like an invitation he wasn't used to extending. I sat in the chair across from his desk, hands folded tightly in my lap, aware of every camera I imagined watching us, every man in a dark suit standing somewhere beyond that door who would know, within the hour, that the boss had asked the new maid to sit. "You're not like the others," he said. "The other staff? The other people who come through this house." He finally looked up, and there was something almost tired behind his eyes, a weight I hadn't expected from a man who controlled a room simply by entering it. "Everyone who works for me wants something. Money, protection, favor. You—" He stopped, like he was reconsidering the sentence. "You flinch when I walk past. You're the only person in this house who's actually afraid of me, instead of what I can do for them. Should I not be afraid?" The words left me before I could stop them. Something almost like amusement crossed his face. "You should be. I'm not telling you not to be." He leaned back in his chair, studying me the way he had that first day on the stairs, like I was a puzzle he hadn't decided whether to solve. "I'm telling you that it's rare, and I find I don't mind it as much as I should." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I stood, murmured something about finishing my rounds, and left before my face could betray anything more than it probably already had. The weeks that followed blurred into a strange new rhythm. 4:00 tea became 15 minutes of conversation, then 20. Then, on the days his men were away and the house went quiet in that particular way that meant no one important was watching. Almost an hour, the tea going cold between us while he asked me questions no one in that house had ever cared to ask. Where I was from, why I'd taken this job, whether I had someone waiting for me at home. I told him about my mother in Ohio, about the diner I used to work at before it closed, about how I'd learned to sew because we couldn't always afford new clothes. He listened like the information mattered, like he was filing it away somewhere he intended to keep it safe. He told me almost nothing about himself, but I learned him anyway, the way you learn a person through absence and gesture rather than words. I learned that he hated when his men raised their voices in the house, that he touched the base of his throat, just above where the tattoos began, when he was thinking through something dangerous. I learned that he ate very little, and that when he did eat, he always waited until everyone else at the table had been served first, an old habit that seemed strange for a man who could have anything he wanted the moment he wanted it. I learned that despite everything Mrs. Alvarez had warned me about, despite every reason I had to keep my distance, I had started looking forward to 4:00 more than I was willing to admit to myself. It was late one evening, well past when my shift should have ended, when I found myself alone in the west hallway restocking linens and heard raised voices coming from the front entrance. Not Minho's voice. His was never raised, but 2 men, arguing in Korean, the words too fast for me to follow, though the tension in them needed no translation. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that, even as I was doing it, easing toward the corner of the hallway where I could see without being seen. Minho stood in the entryway, flanked by 2 of his men, facing a 3rd man I didn't recognize, older, heavy-set, with the kind of confidence that came from believing himself untouchable. Behind him stood 2 more men I hadn't seen before, their jackets cut in a way that didn't match the house's usual staff. "You've been careless, Minho, the older man said, switching to English. Maybe for my benefit. Maybe because he wanted his words understood by whoever might be listening. A maid. In your house. Do you understand what that looks like to the families who still remember what happened to your father?" Something in Minho's posture went very still. "My father's business is not a conversation we're having tonight, Sang-hoon. It's exactly the conversation we should be having. Weakness is a door. You've left yours open." The man's eyes flicked briefly toward the hallway, toward me, and I shrank back against the wall, heart hammering. Close it before someone else does. Is that a threat? It's a warning, from someone who still remembers you as a boy who cried at his mother's funeral. The older man's voice softened, just slightly, into something almost paternal, almost worse for it. "I'm trying to protect you, Minho, the way I promised your father I would." "Then protect me by leaving," Minho said, and though his voice never rose above a low, even register, something in it made the older man's men shift uneasily. "Whatever you think you saw in this house is not your concern. And if anyone touches what's mine, I won't extend the same courtesy I'm extending you tonight." The words settled over the hallway like a verdict. Sang-hoon studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he inclined his head, not quite a bow, not quite a retreat, and turned toward the door, his men falling into step behind him. Minho didn't move until the sound of car engines faded down the long drive. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the hallway where I stood frozen, and I understood, with a sick drop in my stomach, that he had known I was there the entire time. "Come here," he said quietly. I walked toward him on legs that didn't feel entirely mine. "How much did you hear?" "Enough," I admitted, because lying to him felt more dangerous than the truth. He said I was. A weakness. A door. Something flickered across his face. Not anger. Exactly. But a kind of controlled devastation, like he'd been dreading this exact conversation for weeks and had run out of ways to avoid it. "You are not a weakness," he said, low and fierce. "You hear me? Whatever they think, whatever they say." He stopped himself, jaw tightening, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something almost raw. "I have spent my entire life being told what I am allowed to want. This house, this name, this business. None of it was ever a choice. You are the first thing I have wanted that had nothing to do with any of it. I didn't trust myself to speak. That terrifies me more than Sang-hoon ever could," he admitted, and for the first time since I'd met him, Minho Kang looked less like the man everyone in that house feared, and more like someone standing at the edge of something he couldn't control. "What happens now?" I whispered. His eyes held mine, dark and unwavering. "Now I make sure no one ever looks at you like that again." 2 days after the confrontation with Sang-hoon, my entire routine changed without anyone bothering to ask me if I wanted it to. Mrs. Alvarez pulled me aside before my shift, her expression carefully neutral in a way that told me she'd been given instructions she didn't necessarily agree with. "You're being moved," she said. "Different quarters. Inside the main house, not the staff wing." "Why?" She glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice even though we were alone. "Because Mr. Kang requested it. And when Mr. Kang requests something, Hannah, it isn't really a request." Her eyes softened, just slightly, the closest thing to sympathy I'd seen from her since I arrived. "Be careful. I don't say that to frighten you. I say it because I've seen what happens to people who get close to men like him. It rarely ends the way they hope." I wanted to tell her she didn't understand, that whatever was happening between Minho and me wasn't the careless kind of closeness she was imagining. But I didn't have words for what it actually was, so I said nothing, and let her walk me to a room 3 doors down from his. larger than anything I'd had before, with a window that looked out over the gardens instead of the service entrance. That evening, there was a new guard posted outside my door. Not inside. He made a point of that, I noticed, standing just outside the frame like an unspoken boundary. But present, unmistakably present, in a way that made my new status in the house impossible to misread. I found Minho in his study later, staring at a folder of documents he wasn't really reading. "You didn't ask me," I said without preamble, "about moving my room." He looked up, and for a moment I saw something almost sheepish cross his face, an expression that seemed foreign on a man who commanded rooms simply by breathing in them. "Would you have said no?" "That's not the point." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He set the folder down, giving me his full attention in that unnerving way he had, like nothing else in the world existed once he decided to look at you. After what Sang-hoon said, after what almost happened with Deacon in the hallway that first week, I can't have you 3 buildings away where I can't reach you if something goes wrong. I know that isn't fair to you. I know it isn't your choice. But I'm not going to apologize for wanting you safe. You don't get to decide what safe looks like for me. "No," he said again, quieter this time. "You're right. I don't." He rose from behind the desk, crossing the room slowly, giving me every opportunity to step back if I wanted to. I didn't. "Tell me what you want then. Not what you think you're supposed to want. What you actually want." The question hung in the air between us, more dangerous than anything Sang-hoon had said in that hallway. "I don't know," I admitted, and it was the most honest thing I'd said since I'd walked through the gates of that house. "I know I should be terrified of you. I know everything about this, the guards, the guns I pretend not to notice, the way grown men flinch when you walk into a room, should send me running. But I keep staying anyway, and I don't know what that says about me." "It says you see past what they see," he said. Close enough now that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the small, careful way his hands stayed at his sides, like he was disciplining himself not to reach for me until I gave him permission. "Everyone else in this house sees the name, the business, what I can do to them or for them. You're the only person who's ever looked at me like I might be more than that." "Are you? More than that?" Something raw passed over his face. "I don't know anymore. I've been this..." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the house, at everything it represented. "For so long, I'm not sure what's left underneath. But when I'm with you, I think I remember. A little. I closed the last of the distance between us before I could talk myself out of it, and when his hand finally came up to cup my face, it trembled slightly. Like even now, after everything, he wasn't entirely certain he was allowed to want this. "Hannah." My name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before. Not an order, not a formality, but something closer to a prayer. "I need you to understand what it means if you stay. I can't promise you safety. I can't promise you a normal life. Everything about this world will try to take you from me, and I will burn it to the ground before I let that happen. That's not a metaphor. That's who I am." "I know," I whispered. "Do you?" "I've watched you for 3 weeks," I said. "I've seen what you are. I'm choosing it anyway." The kiss, when it came, was nothing like I expected from a man capable of the violence I'd witnessed in that hallway. It was careful, almost reverent, his hand cradling my jaw like I was something breakable he'd been afraid to touch for far too long. When he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, I felt the tremor still running through him, and understood that whatever control he wielded over every other part of his life, he had none at all when it came to this. "I should tell you to run," he murmured. "Every instinct I have that isn't selfish is telling me to send you away tonight, put you on a plane, make sure you never have to know what it costs to stand this close to me. But you're not going to. No, he admitted, something fierce and unguarded breaking through his voice. God help me, I'm not. The peace didn't last a week. I was in the kitchen early one morning, before most of the house had woken, when I heard the front gates buzz, not the careful, expected arrival of one of Minho's men, but something urgent, frantic, the kind of sound that made Mrs. Alvarez go pale even before she reached the intercom. "It's Deacon," she said, voice tight. "The one from the hallway. He's back, and he's not alone." By the time I reached the front hall, Minho was already there, and the temperature of the entire house had changed. Deacon stood just inside the gate, flanked by two men I didn't recognize, a thin, cruel smile on his face that made my stomach twist. "Just came to deliver a message," Deacon said, eyes flicking briefly toward me before returning to Minho. "Sang-hoon sends his regards. Says he's disappointed you didn't take his warning seriously." His smile widened. "Says maybe it's time someone showed you what happens to men who let a pretty face distract them from business." "You shouldn't have come back here," Minho said, and his voice had dropped into that register I'd learned to fear more than any shout. Quiet, absolute, final. "Wasn't my idea." Deacon's eyes found me again, lingering this time, and something cold and possessive moved through the room like a physical force. "But since I'm here..." He never finished the sentence. Minho moved faster than I'd ever seen him move, faster than I thought a person could move, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. And the sound that followed, sharp, brutal, final, sent me stumbling back against the wall, hand pressed to my mouth. When it was over, Deacon was on the ground, and Minho stood over him breathing hard, knuckles split, something terrible and protective blazing in his eyes as he turned to look at me. Checking, cataloging, making certain I was unharmed before he allowed himself to acknowledge anything else. "Get her upstairs," he said to no one in particular, though his eyes never left mine. "Now." "Minho." "Please," he said, and it was the first time I'd ever heard him say that word, low and urgent, stripped of every ounce of the control he usually wore like armor. "Please just let me handle this. I need to know you're safe before I can think straight." I let one of the guards lead me upstairs, my legs shaking with every step, the sound of Minho's voice, cold, furious, giving orders in rapid Korean to the men now surrounding Deacon, following me the whole way. I didn't know. Standing at my window 20 minutes later, watching cars pull away down the long gravel drive, whether I had just witnessed the end of something or only the beginning. Minho didn't come to me that night. I waited in my new room, watching the door, listening to the muffled sounds of activity that carried through the house. Hushed voices, cars arriving and leaving, the particular quality of silence that meant something serious was being handled below. It was nearly midnight when Mrs. Alvarez finally appeared, carrying a tray I hadn't asked for. "He asked me to bring you this," she said, setting down tea I knew neither of us would drink. "He also asked me to tell you he's sorry, that he'll explain everything tomorrow. Is he all right?" Something shifted in her expression, not quite softening, but closer to it than I'd seen before. "He's not hurt, if that's what you're asking. But I've worked for this family a long time, Hannah, and I've never seen him like this. Sang-hoon isn't a man who sends a message and walks away when it fails. He'll come back, and Mr. Kang knows it. What happens now?" She hesitated at the door, hand on the frame. "Now you find out if you actually understand what you agreed to when you told him you'd stay." She left before I could ask her what she meant, though I suspected, somewhere underneath the fear sitting heavy in my chest, that I already knew. He found me the next morning in the garden, the one place in the entire estate that felt like it belonged to a different world entirely. Roses climbing along a stone wall, a fountain that had probably been imported from somewhere I couldn't afford to visit in 3 lifetimes. He looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles carved beneath his eyes, his usual composure worn thin at the edges. "I owe you an explanation," he said, sitting beside me on the stone bench without asking permission, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He turned to face me fully, and I could see him gathering himself, choosing words the way a man chooses which wire to cut on something that might explode. Sang-hoon was my father's closest friend. When my father died, when I was 22 and completely unprepared to run any of this, Sang-hoon was the one who kept the other families from tearing everything apart. I owe him my life, in a way most people would understand literally. And now he's threatening you, because of me. He's not threatening me. Minho's jaw tightened. He's trying to protect an idea of me that stopped being true the moment I met you. He thinks weakness is anything that makes a man capable of being hurt. He's not entirely wrong, but he's wrong about what that means. What does it mean? It means I would burn every alliance I have, every piece of this business my father built, before I let anyone use you against me. His voice had dropped into something low and unwavering. Deacon is dead. I want you to know that, because I won't lie to you, not about this. He came into my house and threatened the person I care about most, and I made a decision I'd make again without hesitation. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle into my chest. Not horror, exactly, though some part of me knew it should have been. Something closer to a terrible, unwanted understanding. And Sang-hoon? Sang-hoon is more complicated. He has allies, men who would use his death as an excuse to move against everything my father built. I can't simply... He stopped, exhaling slowly. I need to handle this carefully, which means, for now, you need to stay close. Closer than you have been. I know that isn't the life anyone dreams of. I know it isn't fair. Stop apologizing for who you are, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. I told you I was choosing this. I meant it. But I need you to actually let me in. Not just protect me from a distance. Not just move me into a bigger room with a guard outside the door. If I'm staying, I want to understand what I'm staying for. Something in his face cracked open, raw and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from him before. My mother used to say something before she died, he said quietly. That the men in this family mistake control for love. That we protect people the way we protect assets. From a distance, behind walls. Never close enough to actually be touched by them. He reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine like it was the most natural gesture in the world. I don't want to be that. I don't want to love you from behind a wall. Then don't. He brought my hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against my knuckles that felt like a vow. Sang-hoon has requested a meeting. Neutral ground, 3 days from now. He wants to negotiate. His terms, presumably, for accepting you as more than just a maid in my house. His eyes met mine, steady despite everything churning beneath the surface. I want you there. Why? Because I'm tired of deciding things about your life without you in the room. A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. And because Sang-hoon respects strength more than anything else, he needs to see that you're not something fragile I'm hiding. He needs to see exactly what I see. The 3 days that followed passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The house tense but functioning, Minho's men doubling in number along the perimeter. Cars I didn't recognize pulling through the gates and departing again at odd hours. I spent most of it at Minho's side, in rooms I'd never been permitted to enter before, listening to conversations in rapid Korean I couldn't follow, but could feel the weight of anyway. On the morning of the meeting, Mrs. Alvarez appeared in my room carrying a garment bag instead of a cleaning cart. "Mr. Kang had this sent for you," she said, something unreadable in her voice, as she laid the bag across the bed. Inside was a dress, simple, elegant, the deep green of the roses climbing the garden wall. along with a small velvet box I didn't dare open until she'd left the room. Inside the box was a bracelet, delicate gold, engraved along the inner band with characters I couldn't read. "It means mine to protect," Minho said from the doorway, and I startled, not having heard him arrive. He crossed the room, taking the bracelet from the box and fastening it gently around my wrist himself, his fingers lingering against my pulse point a moment longer than necessary. Sang-hoon will understand what it means the moment he sees it. Every family in this world will. Is that what today is? A declaration? Today is me telling every person who might think you're a weakness that you are, in fact, the only thing in my life I will never compromise on. His eyes held mine, dark and unwavering. "Are you ready?" I looked down at the bracelet, catching the morning light, at the weight of everything it represented settling around my wrist like a second heartbeat, and thought of the woman I'd been 3 weeks ago, exhausted, invisible, counting the days until her next paycheck, certain no one in that enormous house would ever really see her. "Yes," I said, and meant it completely. "I'm ready." The meeting was held in a private dining room at a hotel neither of us named aloud in the car, though I could feel Minho's tension radiating from him the entire drive, his hand wrapped around mine like an anchor neither of us was willing to release. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside. Old brick, discreet awning, the kind of place that survived on quiet reputation rather than visible wealth. Inside, everything changed. Marble floors, low lighting, men stationed at intervals so subtle I might have mistaken them for staff if I hadn't spent the last month learning to recognize the particular stillness that marked Minho's world. "Whatever happens in there," Minho said quietly, just before we reached the private room. "Don't look away from him." Sang-hoon reads weakness in averted eyes faster than in words. "I won't," I promised, though my pulse was hammering hard enough that I wondered if he could feel it through my hand. The room itself was smaller than I expected. A single round table, white cloth, place settings for 4, though only 3 chairs were occupied when we entered. Sang-hoon sat at the head, exactly as composed and unreadable as he'd been in Minho's front hallway weeks ago, flanked by a woman I didn't recognize, sharp-eyed and silent, and an empty chair clearly meant for Minho. His gaze found me the moment we stepped through the door, and I made myself hold it, the way Minho had asked, even as every instinct screamed at me to look away. "So," Sang-hoon said, his eyes flicking briefly to the bracelet at my wrist before returning to my face. "This is the maid." "This is Hannah," Minho corrected, pulling out my chair himself before taking his seat beside me, a gesture that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. "And she will be addressed with the same respect you'd extend to anyone else in this room." Something flickered behind Sang-hoon's eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or the beginning of reassessment. "You've made your feelings clear with that bracelet, Minho-ya. Every family who matters will know its meaning by tomorrow morning." That was the intention. Bold, for a man who lost one of his own guards to Deacon's foolishness and gained an enemy in his wife's brother. Sang-hoon's tone remained even, almost gentle, but I'd learned enough by now to hear the blade beneath it. "You understand what you've done, don't you? You've given people a target, a weakness to aim for." "With respect," I said, before I could stop myself, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm not a weakness. I'm not something that happened to him. I chose to stay in that house knowing exactly what it meant, and I'll keep choosing it, whatever anyone decides to call me." Silence settled over the table. Beside me, I felt Minho go very still, though whether from surprise or something closer to pride, I couldn't tell. The woman beside Sang-hoon exchanged a brief, unreadable glance with him. Sang-hoon studied me for a long moment, the same way he might study a business proposal he hadn't yet decided whether to trust. "You have his father's temper," he said finally, though it wasn't clear whether he meant me or Minho. He never let anyone speak for him either, even when it would have been wiser to stay quiet. "I'm not interested in being wise if it means being invisible," I said. Something almost like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of Sang-hoon's mouth. "No," he murmured. "I don't imagine you are." He turned his attention back to Minho, folding his hands on the table with the deliberate care of a man about to make a decision he'd already half made before walking into the room. "I came here prepared to ask you to end this, to send her away, quietly, before the other families decided to make an example of your distraction." His eyes moved between us, something unreadable passing behind them. "I find I no longer believe that would accomplish what I intended." "Meaning?" Minho asked, careful, controlled, though I could feel the faint tremor of hope running beneath his stillness. "Meaning your father once told me that the mark of a strong man isn't the absence of anything that could be taken from him. It's what he's willing to burn to keep it." Sang-hoon exhaled, something old and tired moving through his expression. "I watched him die protecting your mother, in the end. I told myself I would never let his son make the same mistake. But perhaps I misunderstood what the mistake actually was. Sang-hoon, I will speak with the other families myself," he continued, cutting off whatever Minho had been about to say. "I will tell them the woman wearing your protection isn't a liability. She's a decision you've made, and one I intend to support, provided—" His eyes moved to me, sharp again, assessing. "She understands the weight of what she's agreeing to. This isn't a fairy tale, Hannah. There will be men who see you as a way to reach him. There will be nights he can't tell you where he's gone, or why. If you cannot live inside that uncertainty, better to know it now than to break beneath it later." I thought about the last month, the fear that had lived in my chest from the first day I walked through those gates, the moments of violence I'd witnessed that should have sent me running, the strange, quiet tenderness that had grown alongside all of it, impossible to separate from the danger that housed it. "I've already been living inside it," I said. "Every day since the first time he looked at me on that staircase. I'm not asking for it to be easy. I'm asking to be trusted with the truth of it, instead of protected from knowing what it costs." Sang-hoon nodded slowly, something settling in his expression that looked almost like respect. "Then we understand each other." He rose from his chair, the woman beside him following suit. "I'll make the calls tonight. By morning, no one who matters will question your household again." At the door, he paused, glancing back at Minho with something that might have been the closest thing to warmth I'd see from him. "Your father would have liked her. He always said the strongest people in this business were the ones who refused to disappear. And then he was gone, leaving Minho and me alone in the quiet room, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly over both of us like snow. We didn't speak until we were back in the car, the city sliding past the windows in streaks of gold and gray. Minho's hand found mine again, quieter now, less anchor and more something gentler. "You surprised me in there," he said finally. "Good surprised or bad surprised?" A faint, genuine laugh escaped him, rare enough that it caught me off guard every time I heard it. The only kind of surprised I want to keep having for the rest of my life. He turned to look at me, something open and unguarded in his expression that the house, with all its cameras and careful men, never seemed to allow him. "I've spent my entire adult life being told that love is a liability in this world, that the men who survive are the ones who never let anyone close enough to be used against them. I believed it, because I never had a reason not to." His thumb traced slow circles against the back of my hand. "Then you walked into that house with your sleeves pushed up, terrified of a world you didn't understand, and refused to let it make you smaller. I don't know how to explain what that did to me except to say I stopped being afraid of exactly the thing Sang-hoon warned me about." "What thing?" "Being known. Not the name. Not the business. Me." His voice dropped, quieter, rawer than I'd ever heard it. You're the only person who has ever looked at me and seen something worth protecting, instead of something to be protected from. I didn't trust my voice, so I leaned into him instead, resting my head against his shoulder as the car wound its way back toward the estate, toward whatever life waited for us on the other side of that meeting. The house felt different when we returned. Not smaller, exactly, but less like a fortress, and more like something that might, eventually, become a home. Mrs. Alvarez met us at the door, and something in her expression when she looked at me had shifted too, softened, the wariness replaced by something closer to acceptance. "There's a call for you, Mr. Kang," she said. "Sang-hoon, he said it couldn't wait." Minho excused himself, and I found myself alone in the garden again, sitting on the same stone bench where he'd first told me the truth about Deacon, about the weight of what I was choosing. The roses were still climbing the wall in that same deep green as the dress I'd worn to face a man capable of ending everything with a single decision. I touched the bracelet at my wrist, tracing the characters I still couldn't read but had come to understand anyway, mine to protect, and thought about how far I'd come from the woman who'd arrived at these gates 3 months ago, invisible, exhausted, certain she'd never be more than the person who cleaned up after other people's lives. Minho found me there 20 minutes later, something different in the way he moved toward me. Lighter, somehow, like a weight he'd carried for years had finally been set down. "Sang-hoon has spoken to the other families," he said, sitting beside me. "It's done. No one will question your place in this house again." Just like that? Just like that. He reached for my hand again, though this time there was something almost hesitant in the gesture, uncharacteristic for a man who commanded rooms without effort. "There's something else. Something I've been thinking about since the meeting, since I watched you refuse to shrink in front of a man who has ended careers with less provocation than you gave him today." "What is it?" He turned to face me fully, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something in his expression that looked almost like nerves. A man accustomed to absolute control, momentarily unsure of his footing. "I don't want you to be someone I protect from a distance," he said. "I don't want you to be a secret the other families tolerate, or an arrangement Sang-hoon negotiated on my behalf. I want the whole world to know exactly what you are to me, with no room left for anyone to question it." He reached into his jacket, and I watched. Breath caught somewhere in my throat as he produced a small box, not the velvet one that had held the bracelet, but something smaller, more deliberate. "Minho." "I know it's fast," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, catching the last of the afternoon light. "I know everything about how we started should have made this impossible, but I have spent my entire life protecting things by keeping them at arm's length, and I'm done doing that with you. I want you beside me, not because I'm afraid of what happens if you're not, but because I can't imagine a version of my life now that doesn't have you in it." His voice steadied, growing certain even as his hands trembled slightly around the box. "Marry me, Hannah. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure no one, not Sang-hoon, not the families, not anyone who ever tries to use you against me, ever makes you feel invisible again." I looked at him, this man who had terrified an entire hallway of trained soldiers, who had built walls around himself so thick he'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to be known, sitting in a garden with his hands shaking around a ring box, asking me to choose him not out of fear or obligation, but out of something that had grown quietly between us over the span of a season. "Yes," I said, and the word came out steadier than I expected, certain in a way that surprised even me. "Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was different from the first, less careful, less restrained, something that had been building for months finally allowed to exist without hesitation. When he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, I felt the same tremor I'd felt that first night, except now I understood it wasn't fear. It was a man who had spent his entire life mistaking control for safety, finally learning what it felt like to hold something precious without needing to cage it. Later that evening, as the house settled into its familiar quiet rhythms around us, I stood at the window of what would soon no longer be a guest room, but simply my room, our room, and looked out over the gardens where everything had changed. Mrs. Alvarez found me there. Carrying a tray of tea, she sat down without a word, though the small, warm smile she gave me said more than any explanation could have. "I told you to be careful," she said finally, settling into the chair across from me like she'd earned the right to speak plainly now. I still think that was good advice, but I didn't expect... She gestured vaguely at the ring on my hand, at the bracelet at my wrist, at everything they represented. This. I've worked in this house a long time, Hannah. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. I never expected it either, I admitted. I came here to clean floors and send money home. I never imagined any of this. Sometimes the life that finds us isn't the one we planned for. She rose, pausing at the door the way she had that first night, though her expression now held none of the warning it had carried then. Whatever comes next, and in this family, something always comes next. I think you'll be all right. He's a different man since you arrived. Softer, in the ways that matter. Harder, in the ways that keep you safe. She smiled, small and genuine. That's not nothing. She left me alone with the quiet, with the roses still visible in the fading light, with the weight of the ring on my finger and everything it promised. Not a fairy tale exactly. Not the easy life anyone dreams of as a little girl, but something realer than that. A life chosen with open eyes, built by two people who had both, in their own ways, spent years being invisible until they found each other. Downstairs I could hear Minho's voice, low and steady, giving quiet instructions to one of his men. The business of his world continuing even now, even in this. It would always be there, I understood. The danger, the vigilance, the careful architecture of protection that surrounded every hour of his life. But so would this, the garden, the bracelet, the way he'd trembled asking me to stay. I touched the window glass, watching my own reflection settle over the darkening grounds below, and thought of the woman who had arrived at these gates 3 months ago, certain she would never be more than what everyone called her. Just a maid. I understood now how wrong they'd been. Not because Minho had made me something else, but because he was the first person who had ever looked closely enough to see what I already was.